For this Sunday's video, we have what is probably an obvious choice. Pearl Harbor Day may have been on a Thursday this year, but that doesn't change a simple fact. No wreck is more fitting for the week of Pearl Harbor than USS Arizona. I will note, however, that this won't be a long video. This is a very well-known wreck, so there is less to add than there normally would be. That isn't to say there aren't interesting things. The interior of the wreck, in particular, is something that is certainly worth showing to a larger audience. As a disclaimer before I move on, I don't think, on a wreck this famous, that I need to emphasize this is a war grave. However, to remind people, this is probably the most famous ship war grave in human history, certainly in American history. Keep that in mind, especially on the interior pictures. Over 1,000 members of her crew remain aboard the ship, although those bodies have long since deteriorated. With that said, let's get into it. As the story of Arizona is incredibly well known, and I have already done a video on her, the summary will be shorter. USS Arizona, the second of the Pennsylvania class, was the most famous victim of Pearl Harbor. While ships like Oklahoma or West Virginia can almost compete for the title, there is no more distinctive image than Arizona's slumped mast. And, of course, her explosion, rivaled only by that of USS Shaw. While the exact cause of that explosion remains debatable, the effect of it isn't. Arizona's bow was obliterated, with her superstructure and forward turrets slumped forward. This explosion, along with secondary explosions and raging fires, killed 1,177 men, about half of the total losses on that December morning. The damage to the battleship in the aftermath of the attack was too severe to justify salvage. The superstructure was largely cut away, the stern turrets were removed, and the guns were pulled out of Turret 2. Of those guns, the stern turrets were installed ashore as shore batteries. The guns from Turret 2 are more of an open question. There's a story of them being repaired and installed on USS Nevada in 1944. There's also a story that the guns on Nevada are from Arizona, but they're actually spares that were ashore when the battleship sank. Either way, Nevada would use guns from Arizona, which was a way for the spirit of the sunken ship to fight back. As for the wreck, it was largely left alone after all the valuable equipment was salvaged. Ammunition was removed, although the same cannot be said for the bodies of the crew. As said before, many of those were never recovered. Many couldn't be recovered as they burnt to ash. Admiral Kidd, for example, was never found. Only his academy ring, fused to the metal of the ship. With that morbid thought in mind, let's look to the wreck. Arizona's wreck, to this day, largely looks the same as she did after the final salvage work was complete. More rusty and gradually falling apart, but mostly the same. This is readily apparent when you compare pictures of the ship before the memorial was put in place to aerial views from the modern day. The overall shape of the battleship remains visible. You can identify the bow and stern, as well as the barbettes of the stern turrets. All of this can be seen from the air, or from the memorial itself. Unfortunately, the same goes for the oil leaking from the wreck, visible in the 1950s and visible today as well. Commonly known as the Tears of Arizona, this originates from cracked and rusting fuel tanks that were never drained. It would make diving on the wreck a bit of a risk, if not for the fact that diving on Arizona is strictly forbidden. The following pictures from beneath the surface all come from the National Park Service. They have exclusive permission to dive on the wreck, and do so with all the respect required of such a grave site. That said, there aren't a lot of publicly available pictures of Arizona beneath the surface. Not a surprise, considering, but it is worth noting. The majority of the exterior pictures are going to be of the number 1 turret for obvious reasons. As seen here from above, this turret looks much the same as it did when the battleship first sank. The guns are fixed in place, leaning down towards the break in the hull. While rusted and encrusted by marine growth, Arizona's one remaining intact turret is just that, an intact turret. Looking at it from underwater, however, the marine growth is much clearer. The barrels are completely covered in it, with very little of the metal still visible. Even with the oil leaking from the wreck, the shallow depth has allowed Arizona to be colonized by marine life. This is, in a way, fitting. In death, the battleship gives life. This is true of most shipwrecks, but when one considers Arizona's violent end, it's all the more poignant. Other than the turret, however, there isn't much to say about the exterior of the wreck. From the surface, looking down, you can see more of the stern. From the slowly rusting deck, as seen here, to the famous barbette rising from the bottom. Or even a ladder leading down into the wreck beneath the surface. And, for that matter, ladders leading into the ship on the bottom. These are the only entrances into the interior of the wreck. Entrances that are, again, off limits to anyone but the National Park Service. It was through those entrances that the next images came to be. Some years back, almost a decade now in fact, PBS did a documentary on the interior of Arizona's wreck. This is very much worth a watch. There's a lot I can't show here, and if you have any interest in the wreck, you should take a look. I'll link both PBS and Amazon in the description if you haven't seen it before. That aside, I'll share a couple pictures from the documentary in this video. There are 2 important things to remember in looking at these images. First, that Arizona is a grave site, even if you won't see any bodies. Second, that the interior is incredibly well preserved. The large amount of silt has ensured that. And on the lower decks, as we'll see, an extreme lack of oxygen. Some of these pictures are reminiscent of other wrecks, like a sink almost completely buried in silt. This is the kind of thing you see on the Titanic wreck, although on Arizona the silt is much higher. The entire room is buried. In a similar vein, there's the intact shelving, with porcelain still shining in its place. Even in a sinking as violent as Arizona's, these remained in place. They weren't broken, they weren't knocked from the shelves. They've simply remained there through 80 years underwater. There are also places where Arizona differs from a wreck like Titanic. That comes in something like this phone, intact and silent on the bottom, waiting for a man to answer a call that will never come. The most striking images, however, come from the lower decks. As I said, the oxygen levels on those decks are incredibly low. Even though Arizona rests in shallow and warm water, this lack of oxygen has preserved things that you would never expect to be intact. For example, a bed covered in mud, but still resting in place. The mud looks almost like a thick blanket, left in place by whoever slept in this bed, made up for Sunday services, and never used again. After that, you have the most haunting images of them all. A uniform jacket, still hanging in a closet. 80 years underwater, and yet still on its hanger. Even the creases are still visible, as if it had just sunk yesterday. I can remember watching the documentary when it first aired. Seeing this was a moment that will stick with me. The kind of thing you watch and get a sudden feeling of men lived and died on this ship. And the kind of thing that you would never, ever expect to see after so many years underwater. I don't know what man this belonged to. I can't put a name to it. But this jacket, hanging where he last left it, is a stark reminder of a life long since lost. A uniform that remains where its owner left it, through fire and decades underwater. It's a haunting image to finish this video on. That said, as we reach the end of this video, I'll say this. It is important to remember this ship, to look at her wreck, and recall how many men are still entombed in her rusting hulk. Arizona won't be there forever, and documenting her while that's still an option is important, to ensure she's never forgotten, that the men aboard her, either from the attack or the cremated ashes of survivors, are never forgotten. We're entering into a time when World War II veterans gradually vanish, as old age catches up to them. Their stories are worth remembering, however we can. That's why I do these videos. That is why I chose to cover Arizona. To remember what will soon be lost forever. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.